again, everyone. Dave here, and today I'm building the Rocketarium KSR-420S. This is a scale model of a Korean sounding rocket, and unlike most of the other Rocketarium models, this is a cluster engine rocket. So it uses standard 18mm motors, but it uses 3 of them. So if you've never done a clustered kit before, this is probably a really good one to start with. As with any kit, we want to start by making sure we have all the parts. And so this is a relatively simple rocket in terms of the number of parts. You can see the list here is relatively short. The parachute and the decals were folded inside the instruction sheet here. So if you don't see them on first glance when you open up your kit, that's probably where they are. Okay, and then as we go through here, we've got a nose cone, a short body tube, a longer body tube, okay, a set of 4 fins, a motor mount kit, and this has again 3 motor tubes here, an ejection baffle kit. And so like most Rocketarium kits, you don't have to use recovery wadding for these. The baffle allows the ejection gases to cool. And then finally we have a little bag here that contains the launch lugs and the shock cord. And note the launch lugs are not the standard 1/8 inch, but are 3/16. To launch this, you will need a little bit heavier launch rod. You'll need a 3/16 inch launch rod. Now, before doing anything else, I highly recommend that you go through and just read through all of the instructions. Make sure you're familiar with what's going to be coming up next. Don't use my video in place of the instructions. I'm here to supplement them. So the first thing we're going to do is take the motor mount bag here, and it's got its own instructions in it. So we'll set this aside. Looks like I need a new blade on that knife. Alright, we'll dump out all the pieces here. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is make sure that we have all of our pieces. Okay, so I've got 2 engine blocks here. One of them is down inside the tube. So if you're missing one of your engine blocks, look in the tubes. Okay, so these are going to get put together here. We will glue in each of those engine blocks so that it is flush with the end of the tube. Alright, and then when we have those all together, this part is going to go on top. Now note here, these holes are smaller than this. In many cluster engine mounts, the centering ring here is meant to actually support the tube. So in a lot of rockets, the tube would fit inside here. In this one, it does not. Okay, so what's going to happen is we're going to have our 3 engine tubes here glued together first, and by their size, they just fit inside our main body tube here. So we really don't need anything to center them within it. Okay. Basically, this is just acting as kind of a super engine block to keep the entire assembly from sliding up through the tube. Now I'm going to use some wood glue here. This will also work with white glue. And I'm just going to use a little applicator here to give me a little bit more control. And so the first thing I'm going to do is just put a ring of glue here right at the edge on the inside of each of the body, or each of the engine tubes. And then I will pop in my engine block here. And then I'm going to use the plastic wrapper here just to protect my surface. And now I'm just going to poke that in. Alright, we've got a stray engine block here. That one doesn't belong there. Okay, so that one's flush, and I'll set that aside to dry. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the other two engine tubes. And now I'm just going to let those dry for 10 to 15 minutes or so, just to make sure that I don't bump the engine blocks out of place while we're doing the next step. Now note that we also don't have any engine clips here, and this is simply due to restrictions on size between these motor tubes and the body tube. And so eventually when we go to launch this, you'll need to use friction fit to hold the engines in place. So usually that involves wrapping a little bit of masking tape around the motors. So I'll let these dry, and when we come back, we'll put the motor mount together. Now that the glue has dried on the motor mounts, and you can see here there are some bubbles in there, but there's a lot of glue attaching all this together, so they're fine. Now we're going to put on the forward engine ring here. And as I said earlier, this is actually more of another engine block. And so the tubes don't go in. When we get this into place, the edges of the motor tubes should be flush with the edges of the wood ring here. And we want to have this mostly lined up, at least, with the holes on the engine tube. So it should look something like this. So here we're just going to put some glue around each of these. Okay, oh, I had some fall down in there. We don't want that. So I'm just going to take an applicator here and wipe that out quickly. Okay, that looks good. Alright, now I'm just going to place this right on top, center that, and I'm going to use my fingers now to go around the sides and make sure that the tubes are flush with the wood. Just like that. Okay. And so now at this point, we wait for the glue to dry again. Now that my motor mount has completely dried here, we're just going to set this aside for a little bit while we mark the body tube here for the fins and the launch lug. And so I've cut this out of the instructions on page 3, and there's nothing on the back of it, so you don't have to worry about cutting off something important. And I'm just going to wrap this around the aft end of the longer body tube, which is the main body tube. And I'm just going to line up the alignment marks there. Got a little shaving of paper. I'm just going to take that off. My knife slipped a little bit while I was cutting that out. And now just take a little bit of masking tape to hold that in place. And then we'll just go around and mark each one of these. Launch lug one here, I'm just going to put a little L down so that I know that one is not a fin line. and then just check quickly and make sure that your alignment guide has not moved. In fact, if you have trouble with this slipping around, you can just move your masking tape or take another piece and just tack it lightly onto the tube for a temporary fit. Now I'm going to take that off, and now you can use a door jamb or one of the specially made fin drawing guides to extend these lines. I'm going to use, this is the Estes fin marking guide here. So to turn it around to the right guide. Now the fin lines only need to go up about halfway the length of the tube. Probably not even that. That's good enough there. Now I'm just rotating each of these around. And then my launch lug line is going to go the entire length of the tube. I've marked my fin and launch lug lines here, and now what I'm going to do is go ahead and mark where the launch lugs go, and so that's going to be 6 inches from the base of the tube, so right here, and the first launch lug will go flush with the aft end of the tube, the second one will go flush with this line. Now, something to consider. In the instructions, the next step is to apply the launch lugs. But if you're going to use a fin alignment guide like this one later on in the build, then save the launch lugs until after you put the fins on. Because if the launch lugs are in place, these types of guides will not fit over the tube. Now if you're using a vertical guide like the Estes guide, then it doesn't make any difference because the rocket will be standing upward and it doesn't have to fit over the launch lugs. Okay, and then the other thing we want to do here is take some fine sandpaper and just lightly sand over where the fins are going to be. And if you need to, you might need to redraw your lines there. Okay, I'm just going to do this all the way around. And this is just going to help the glue hold to the cardboard better without having the glossy surface. And it doesn't take much. Okay, and then I'm also going to do the same for the launch lugs here. So I'm going to do one right here. And then the other one goes up here. Okay. And now I can go on to either gluing on the launch lugs or delaying that step until after I put the fins on. Our next task is to glue the motor mount into the body tube here. And I'm just going to dry fit this first to make sure everything is still where it belongs. Okay, so that's going to work nicely. And the instructions say to put 2 rings of glue up inside there. So for this, I'm going to use a long applicator. And here I'm just going to measure 2.5 inches or about 63 millimeters here. So it's going to be up to right about there. And so I'll just keep that marking there with my thumb. Get some glue on this. And now I'm going to stick that inside, and using my thumb as a stop, I'm just going to go ahead and rotate that all the way around inside there. Okay, and then another ring is going to go about 1/2 inch or about 12 millimeters right inside here. Now normally what we would do is put this in part way, and if this were a single motor mount, you could put your applicator up and go around the sides there. I'm going to do kind of like that, except we're going to have to get in between here. All right, and then as I'm doing this, I'm just going to turn the entire mount. This is going to continue to spread the glue around, and I can't really get this under the camera, but I'm going to check inside here to see where my glue is. Alright, now you don't want to take too long doing this, and now what I'm going to do is just take the entire tube here and push it down over the motor mount. Alright, so that the edge of the motor mount now is flush with the body tube. Okay, and once more I can check for the glue in here. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and just use my applicator and apply some more glue along the edges where the tubes of the motor mount meet the body tube here. And that's just to make sure that everything is locked in good and tight. Okay, now do make sure you don't get glue down inside the motor mount tubes. Alright, so now I'm going to let this set aside to dry. Alright, and our next part here is the launch lug attachment. I'm going to wait on that until the engine mount is fully dry inside there. We can go ahead and skip this briefly and assemble the ejection baffle, since it's going to be completely independent from the rest of the construction here until we actually install it. So the ejection baffle comes as a little independent kit here inside. And it's got its own instructions. So we'll just pull that out. The parts often get stuck up inside of it here. Alright, so we should have a baffle plate and another baffle plate there, and then a screw eye and a coupler. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is to simply take my forward baffle plate, and I'm just going to put a little spot of glue inside the hole here. And then I'm going to take the screw eye and put that through. Now what I'm doing, note that along the shaft of the screw eye here, there's a threaded portion and then a smooth portion. You want to screw this in just until the threaded portion can no longer be seen in the glue there. You want to have a little bit of the thread sticking out this way so that we're not trying to bind to the smooth part here. This gives the strongest joint is when you've got a little bit of thread here and most of the thread out here. And then on the back side, I'm just going to cover the remaining part of the screw there with a little bit of glue. Alright, and then for the aft baffle plate here. For this one, we're simply going to make a bead of glue here. And this part of the instructions calls for a fairly thick bead. Okay. And then here we're just going to put this inside like that. And I'm just going to push this in on just a little bit here. So we just got about 2 millimeters or so of an edge. Alright, and inside that's pushed all the glue up in there to make itself into a nice fillet. If you want to here, you can then take a little bit more glue and just fill in that fillet, but don't get it on the outside of the coupler. So I'm just going to fill this in here. And I'm going to make sure and wipe off the outside edges. Okay, and now I'm going to let that dry for just a little while so that I'm not trying to do too many things at once with wet glue in the equation there. I'm going to fill in this gap just a little bit here. There we go. Okay, so we'll let that dry for at least 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and put the other baffle plate in. While the ejection baffle is drying now, we can come back to the launch lug attachment. So we have 2 of these, and one will go flush with the base of the rocket, and the other is going to go about 6 inches from the base. So here's our launch lug line here, and I'm just going to take a bead of glue along its length. Alright, and now I'm just going to set this on my line, and I'm going to pull it right back off again and give this about 30 to 60 seconds to get tacky. And now I'm going to go ahead and put that launch lug back on. And by giving a little bit of tackiness ahead of time, this just keeps it from trying to slip and move on us. Alright, I'm going to look down, make sure I'm straight. And then I'll do the same thing with the other launch lug. Once again, I'm just going to apply this quickly and bring it back up. Okay, and we're going to put this back on. And then once more, check for alignment, and you can just sight down here. Okay, so if you have the 2 launch lugs lined up and they in turn are lined up with your line, then you are good to go. The launch lug glue is drying and close to dry here. I'm going to set this aside, and we're going to come back to our ejection baffle sub-kit. Alright, and so now on this end, that'll have the forward baffle plate on it, we're going to put a wide but thin band of glue here. So I'm starting off, it's going to be kind of thick. Alright, I'll just take a finger here and widen that out. Alright, and then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put this in sideways. Alright, and then I'm going to pull it back so that it's forming a glue fillet around itself. And I'm just going to smooth that around and then just kind of level it out with my finger here. Again, with about 2 millimeters or so inside the coupler. And now I'm just going to let this finish drying. Okay, so our next step is to prepare the fins and then attach those. Now these are basswood or basswood fins. You know, for more than 50 years I have no idea which one is the proper pronunciation. And according to the instructions, we need to round the leading edge here and then just sand smooth the sides. We don't need to do anything to the other edges, although if you want to, you are certainly welcome to either round or taper or fully streamline those. But for the kit instructions, it's just suggesting to round the forward edge. Now, since this is a tighter grain than balsa has, you don't necessarily need to use any type of sanding sealer on this, although, again, you're welcome to if you want. I found that with this wood, I can get pretty close to the same result by just adding another layer or two of primer, and it's a little bit less work. So whatever your preference on that. I'm going to start my shaping with some 100 grit sandpaper here, and although, you know, watching someone sand fins is probably ranking up there with watching golf. But I'm going to do the first one here, and then I'll do the rest of them off camera. So here I'm just going to start on both edges by simply sanding down the corner edge a little bit. I'm doing that, flipping back and forth. And then as we get that sanded down, I'm slowly moving the fin so that it becomes more rounded as I'm moving back and forth with the sandpaper. So I suggest starting this with a medium grit, about 100 to 120, and then finish it off with a fine grit, 150, 220, somewhere in there. Now as I get it more rounded, I can round it even more, this time just moving my sandpaper in a curve. Okay, I've got a little bit of a flat edge here yet, and if I look at it in profile, this edge is not as sanded as the other side, so a little more work on this side. Okay, a little bit more there. Okay, so that's pretty close there. Still got just a little bit of a flat spot on the edge. And that's actually one of the nice things about these laser cut fins is if you can still see the little bit of brown residue there, it needs a little bit more sanding. Okay, now once I've got that done, I'm just going to lightly sand the other edges, especially the root edge here, so that the slightly charred material from the laser cutter does not interfere with the glue. And then the rest of it, again, if you want to taper these, that's up to you, but according to the instructions, they can be left squared. So I'm just going to take off the laser residue there. Alright, and that's about all the sanding I want to do on a camera here, and I'm sure you're getting tired of watching it already. So off camera, I'm going to go ahead and smooth out the surfaces here, and I'll do the other fins as well. I have my fins all sanded, and they're ready to put on. Now, if you're going to use a fin alignment guide like this one, wait on putting your launch lugs on, because this type of a fin alignment guide will not fit over these launch lugs. Now, if you're using another type like the Estes one that stands it up vertically, it won't make any difference. And if you're just going to do this by hand, that won't make any difference at all. But hopefully, if you're planning on using this style of a guide, you've watched ahead on the video, so you know not to put these on until after the fins. So to start this, I'm simply going to run a bead of glue along the root edge. Just like this, and smooth it out. And initially here, you don't want a really thick bead of glue, because this is just to attach it. We'll strengthen it with fillets later. All right, and just like I did with the launch lug, I'm going to put this on to the line here, just like this. And then we'll pull it off again. And it kind of smeared there. I'm just going to take my finger and put that right along the line. Alright, and now, once that's tacked up a little bit, I'm going to put that back on and hold it there for a few seconds. Okay, and the edge of the root edge of the fin should be flush with the base of the tube. Now here I've put on my fin guide, and this just allows me to get really good straight fins on. If you don't have one of these, you can just do it by hand. The advantage to this is you don't have to wait quite as long for the glue to dry. If you're doing these by hand, you want to make sure the glue is completely dry before you go to the next fin. On this one, you can do it at about 5 minutes after you've glued it on there. So I'm going to go off camera and put the rest of my fins on. Now that my fin glue is dry, we can put the fillets on. And here I'm just going to use some more wood glue and run a bead of glue here along the length. And then just use my finger to smooth that in. Now this is another area where personal preference and aesthetic comes into play here. Structurally, a thin fillet like this is sufficient. Now some people like to build up the fillets so that the fin edge blends better into the body tube. And to do that, you can either use multiple glue fillets like this, where you need to let one dry completely before you go to the next, or you can use a wood filler or a wood putty to build these up as well. If you really want to go for super strong and super smooth, you can use epoxy. However, epoxy weighs quite a bit more, and if you do use it, I would be sure to check your stability of the rocket before flying it, because that will shift a significant amount of weight backwards away from the center of gravity. And will change where your center of gravity is. Alright, and then we'll do the same thing with the launch lugs. I'm just going to stand that up for a minute while I clean off my finger. Okay, I'm going to let this dry, and you'll want to dry it horizontally. What can happen if you stand it on end is that the semi-soft glue will migrate toward gravity and you'll end up with uneven fillets. So I'm just going to stand this on here. Alright, after the fillets have dried, then we'll attach the ejection baffle and attach the upper part of the body tube and then go on to the nose. And speaking of the nose, okay, we may have some flash along this seam, or you may have a little bit of a groove there. And the instructions don't specify any particular treatment for this. You can sand this, and that's what I'm going to do at the very least. And that'll take the seam down and some of this roughness of this seam as well. The little bit of gap that remains there, kind of a little valley, that can be filled in with either some plastic putty or with fillable primer. I'm going to do the latter. But I'm just going to take some fine paper here first of all and sand along there. Now I'm going to lightly sand the entire nose cone. This will help the paint to adhere later on. And this is just something you can do while you're waiting for glue to dry. Okay, so that's roughened up the entire surface, which is good for the paint. If you want, I used 150 grit sandpaper on here. I will over sand that with either some 220 or some 400 grit, so it's not quite so rough. If you're using a filling type of primer on it, the roughness here is fine. You'll fill that in and sand it down anyway. My fillets are dry. And our last major task here is to install the ejection baffle and then couple that with the smaller forward body tube. So the first thing we're going to do here is find a center point. So this is measuring at 2 inches long, or just under. So I'm just going to put a mark here at 1 inch. Or about 2.5 centimeters. And so the end without the screw eye on it goes into the main body tube here. And so I'm just going to run a bead of glue around the inside of that tube. I'm just going to spread it around here with my fingers. and I'm just going to slide this in until I reach that mark. I'm just going to twist it back and forth a little bit to help distribute the glue better. Okay. And now I'm just going to let that cure for a couple of minutes here, and then we'll put the other side on. While the glue is drying, we can go ahead and attach the shock cord to the ejection baffle screw eye. And so I'm just going to make a couple of half hitches here and just really tighten that down, not so much that we break the elastic, but to thin it out a lot so that as it rebounds it holds itself. Okay, so just a couple of overhand knots or half hitches. And then I'm going to cut off the excess here down to about 1 centimeter. We want to leave some on there so that as this pulls, it doesn't pull through. And then I'm going to put just a little dab of my wood glue on the knot here. And just kind of work that around. And you can do this with wood glue or white glue. Do not use cyanoacrylate or plastic cement for this, as both of those can damage the rubber. It's been a few minutes now, and our last task will be to attach the upper body tube onto the coupler. And first I'm simply going to draw the shock cord through here. The instructions suggest putting a paper clip or something on the end. You really don't need to. It's a fairly heavy shock cord. Now the tricky thing here is we want to keep some tension on it when we go to put the glue on and insert the coupler in, so that we don't get a bunch of glue all around here and on the shock cord. So for this part I'm going to go ahead and use a little cotton applicator just to give me some more control. And so I'm going to put a thin layer all the way around. Not quite as thick as I might usually do if I didn't have a shock cord in the way. Okay, and then just, if you see here, the way I've got it, the shock cord is still above the edge here, so it's not touching yet, and I'm just moving around with my applicator. So now I've got a glue ring all around, and now I'm pulling gently on the shock cord as I move the tube into position here. Okay, and I'm still holding it down here. I'm putting some tension there again. And now I'm just going to move that body tube into place. And again, go ahead and give it a little bit of a twist to help spread the glue. If you want to line up the spirals, you can. It doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Okay, and I'm going to hold this for just a few minutes while that dries so it doesn't try to expand back out and leave a big gap there. The last thing to do will be to attach the shock cord to the nose cone and then attach the parachute to that. But I'm going to wait on that until after I paint the rocket, because I want to paint the nose cone will be painted 2 different colors, and so I don't want it attached while I do that. So structurally, this rocket's pretty much done. Again, aside from the nose cone and the parachute. And this is the end of part 1. In the second part of the video, I will look at painting, and I'm not going to show step by step the painting here. I'll leave that up to yourselves there. But I will go into how to attach the decals. This has both water slide and vinyl decals, and so there's a little bit different techniques for both of those. And then also some options that you might want to do in place of or in addition to the normal build. And so I will see you back in part 2. Actually, I don't know why I always say that. You will see me back in part 2.